Hello, everyone. My name is Jordan Smith, and I'm the voice and the astrologer for this channel, Nonconformist Conscience. And today's talk is on Saturn's medicine and how discipline becomes healing. I find that Saturn, the archetype of Capricorn in general, can be very misunderstood because we don't often see some of the natural ways that it shows up. And we think of Saturn returns or Saturn transits as being hard or punishing. And so I really wanted to focus on how Saturn can be medicine and how it can be really healing whenever we know how to understand it in a natural sense. I am going to get into some of the distortions of it because, in order for us to understand the complexities of archetypes, it's good to understand both sides, right? That way we can have an awareness and really work with it and tap into the medicine of it. So, in evolutionary astrology, Saturn represents the structure of our consciousness itself. You can think of Saturn in your chart even as the bones of the house of your chart, right? Saturn, it reflects conditioning. So it colors everything in your chart. It conditions everything in your chart. If you have a moon in, say, Pisces, you walk into that room of the Pisces moon, but if you peel back the wallpaper, there is your Saturn, right? It's the structures. So it's the way we experience time, space, and reality as well. It's the invisible framework through which life takes shape. Saturn reflects, like I said, the conditioning we're born into and conditioning itself. So it's our families and our culture, our societies and the rules that taught us who we were allowed to be in order to survive. And that's really connecting Capricorn with Taurus, part of that Earth trine. So, at its core, Saturn, it's not about punishment whenever it's naturally expressed. It's really about how we build a life of integrity. Integrity is a Capricornian Saturnian word. And when Saturn is naturally expressed, it shows us how to live responsibly, another Capricorn word. And it's how to apply wisdom, Capricorn, Saturn, gained through experience, and how we emotionally mature, how to emotionally mature. It's how we set clear boundaries and how to make sound judgment calls that are aligned with our values, linking back to integrity. So Saturn is where we become self-determined, where we take accountability for our choices and recognize our role in shaping our circumstances. This is so important to understand, especially because if we're thinking about this through the evolutionary astrology lens, um, you know, that is a teaching that I feel a lot of people um, can be triggered by. So, accountability is knowing, what's yours and what's not yours. But also, it's linked to responsibility, another Saturnian word. And each one of us, when we come in and we choose to reincarnate into this life, we choose the circumstances. Um, some of them are fated, but most of them are free will. But whenever we're thinking about our own evolutionary growth and how evolution takes time, Saturn, um, we we pick up where we left off, right? And so we will choose certain cultures, families, societies, philosophies, all different types of dynamics before we come back in, before we reincarnate. And we choose this because on a soul level, we're needing to recondition ourselves back into that experience. And this ties into Saturn transits as well, which I'll get into in a minute. But we choose this. We choose our family, which a lot of times it's like, why would I choose this? And it's because that family that we're choosing is going to help recondition us in the ways in which we need to be because we left off. It's teaching us about some type of emotional dynamic. It's kind of pulling in the polarity of Cancer with the moon. That way we can learn how to evolve through those emotional dynamics. So when we look at even choosing our own family, even if you're like, why in the hell would I choose this family? Um, I like to think of it in a more positive way. It's like before we got here, reincarnated again, it's like we were, you know, reflecting Saturn, Capricorn, and thinking about this is the best way in which I can pick up where I left off of. And it doesn't mean that it's going to be fun or amazing. It could be hard. It could be filled with grief. It could be so many different things, negative and positive, and yet the soul is the determinant of its circumstances. And so we will choose a family that helps to recondition us. And so it's like almost before we reincarnate back in, we're like, yes, um, this might be uncomfortable. It might induce insecurity. It might not be what I really want, but it's going to be what it is that I need. And to me, there's something really beautiful in that because it's almost like before we reincarnate, if we understand that we're choosing the circumstances, we understand that we had a belief in ourselves that I can do this, that I can master this, Capricorn, Saturn. I can trust myself that I can work through this and mature. And so that is where we can take accountability. Like, yeah, I chose this. Now, did I choose to be treated awfully? Like, if that's something that happened, no, that's where you don't have to take accountability, right? Like, um, I want to make myself really clear about that. It's also where in our relationships, we have to take accountability. At some point, we made a choice, we made a judgment call, and it led to situations that sometimes aren't very pleasant. And did you deserve what might have like what happened to you that could have been disillusioning or where you experienced betrayal? No, that's not yours. That person had a choice, but yet there is an accountability that one can have and a responsibility of that was my choice to enter into this, and now I know different. So it was important for me to really convey this because I think a lot of people take that and run with it and they feel like there's like this victim blaming of like, and I think also that sometimes it's the way that this is expressed and it can be very much like victim blaming if I'm thinking of like hot buzzwords right now. But when we really get down to the bottom of it, that is what this is reflecting. It's not like, oh, someone hurt you. Well, you chose that. That's your fault. That's not what I'm talking about. It's more of the principle that I'm expressing. So when Saturn becomes distorted, the structure of consciousness can collapse inward, right? It's again, it's pulling that polarity. In of Cancer and the moon, and it's also the sextile to Pisces, right? We can collapse inward. We're left with ourselves. Like it's like, oh, or we become disillusioned, or we feel very insecure. And it's because there's a lack of mastery, and that collapse is actually teaching us about mastery in a lot of different ways. So whenever it's distorted and there can be this um, collapse of the structure within our consciousness, we may begin to struggle with self accountability. This, again, is huge. We can tend to suppress emotions that can lead to the collapse, okay? And we're suppressing emotions that we don't really know how to hold. Maybe we weren't taught that. Maybe we didn't have an authority figure in our life to naturally show us how to hold our emotions. They might have taught us, I'll give you something to cry about whenever you expressed your natural emotions when you were younger. Or this is also, you know, where those emotions can harden into rigidity, fear, and shame. This is really linking the square to Aries and also the trine to Virgo. Virgo being the shame, and then the square to Aries can be the fear, right? And so we can become judgmental of others because we lack the capacity to self reflect, which is a huge Saturnian dynamic, self reflection. So we're losing the capacity to self reflect on our own judgments. And this is also where if Capricorn is linked to Aquarius, or Saturn in some type of way is linked to Uranus or the 11th house. Not always, but sometimes this can be where we're actually denying our own emotional experience of not self-reflecting and looking at the judgments. And so now we're starting to project judgments onto other people. And this is where scapegoating can come in. That is a Capricornian phenomenon. Um, so that's another dynamic to look at, And then the other thing is with the distortion of Capricorn, this is where we really may appear to hold authority by repeating what we've been taught, but we actually lack a sense of authority. So we could be parroting external rules or voices, rather than discovering our own inner authority. So this can be the person who researches all the time and who um, knows how to really talk and express what it is that they have been reading or listening to, and yet there's a lack of actual experience, direct experience within that. So there's almost this dissonance that can happen, right? So over time, this lack of reflection can lead to a deep sense of futility. And it's not because life is meaningless, okay? But it's because Saturn is asking us to slow down, to take responsibility, to look inward, and to consciously restructure the way we relate to ourselves and reality. That's linking, Saturn Capricorn with Taurus. So there's this dynamic of if we don't feel good about ourselves, Taurus, and we are not self-reflecting, we can experience depression, right? Because there's this suppression of our emotional dynamics. And so there's this call whenever there's a sense of futility or depression that comes up. That's really like this echo that the soul is trying to emanate and say, hey, there's something emotional here that we're needing to look at. We're needing to reflect on. That way we can understand. That way we can mature. There can be a natural maturation process. So this is where Saturn really becomes medicine through all of these dynamics. And so when we're looking at Saturn, and how Saturn connects to healing, it's healing through structures and containment. Structure is definitely Saturn, and containment is the Taurus linkage slash Venus dynamic. So Saturn provides the container that allows healing to occur safely. So without structure, emotions can overwhelm the nervous system. And Saturn teaches us to really know how to hold experience slowly, consciously, and sustainably. That's why Saturn and Capricorn is also linked with being a late bloomer sometimes. Sometimes it takes a while for us, especially if we've come into conditioning situations where it's been oppressive and we've learned to suppress our own sense of authority. There's a need to recover that, and that is through a restructuring of our consciousness, of allowing ourselves and giving ourselves permission to be our own authority, meaning that we can throw off those conditioning dynamics. We can feel safe within ourselves through self-reflecting and actually looking at what it is that we're afraid of, right? That way it helps the nervous system calm and it soothes it and it helps one to feel more like an authority. And so, uh, healing with Saturn also, it comes through healing our relationship with time. Saturn reminds us that healing is not instant. It unfolds through patience and repetition and consistency. This is the linkage to Virgo. And so trauma often fractures our sense of time, and Saturn can really be healing because it can restore it. And so healing conditioning through awareness is another way that this funnels into it. So this is where we can recognize familial, cultural, and societal conditioning. Like, oh, I gave my sense of authority over because I was told and taught and conditioned by my family about these expectations, linkage to Libra, that if I did this, and this, that I would be happy, that I would feel a sense of authority. And most people who are coming to this channel are not going to relate to that kind of consensus check list that you check off, okay? And so there's this need to even look at how we operate and how that corresponds to the conditioning and the structures held within, and where it is that we're needing to differentiate between what we've inherited and what is truly ours to carry forward. So again, it's bringing in accountability and responsibility in a really healing and beautiful way. So that's where I get to this healing through self-accountability. So this means not to self-blame. Um, Saturn medicine, it teaches us responsibility without shame. And healing really happens when we reclaim authorship over our choices instead of remaining stuck in victimhood or guilt. So if we are constantly um, looking and experiencing the situations and circumstances that we are coming into contact with, and yet we're always feeling like it's someone else's fault. Someone else betrayed me. They did this, they did that. And why am I always getting into this experience? And this always happens to me. And this is the role that I'm playing. That is a structure within one's consciousness. And it's actually a lack of authority, right? And so having accountability and responsibility without shaming yourself and um, understanding the authorship over your own choices really can be self-healing. It can be, yeah, I chose to have this relationship, or I entered into this space or, put in whatever it is that you want. And yes, that was not cool what happened with that person, but also there's this need to look at why did I choose that? What was going on there? So there's a peeling back, another layer, and that helps us to reclaim authorship over our choices. And we're meant to do it in a non-shameful way, which is if only I had listened to myself, or I messed up and I've got to start all over again, or being very judgmental of ourselves for choosing something. I want you to think about that Maya Angelou quote, whenever I knew better, I did better. That really exemplifies the Saturnian role, and it's really where we're meant through the linkage to Pisces, Neptune, that sextile between Capricorn and Pisces, to forgive ourselves. It's okay. This is a process. It's a marathon, not a sprint. There are things that we are going to learn along the way. And that's really where we can start to emotionally mature. So Saturn really invites us to feel emotions fully without suppressing or acting them out unconsciously. And emotional regulation becomes a form of medicine. And then that happens usually through healing through boundaries, right? We, when we self-reflect and we allow ourselves to recall something or to look at the roles in which we played in something, even if we didn't like it, even if we, experienced hardship or betrayal, it's really inviting us to look at where did I lead myself to this situation, and where can I really reflect on the emotional dynamics, because there's this cause and effect here. Like our choices lead to situations that bring up emotional dynamics, and then it's through the self-reflection and understanding where exactly our choice led to that situation that we can gain wisdom, because we're learning about consequences of choices. Um, and consequences can be negative and positive, okay? It's not fragmented, black or white, wrong or right, evil or good. That is a very much Saturn distorted with Pisces 12th house, Neptune kind of dynamics, because that's really pulling in more of a patriarchal man-made sense of uh, viewing the world and structuring our consciousness. Nothing's all bad or all good. It is a technicolor world, and it is relative, right? So when we're healing through boundaries with what I just discussed as well, this is where Saturn is teaching us about our limits. And that's why the self-reflection and the maturation process really can unfold and the healing can begin, because clear boundaries protect energy. They prevent burnout and they create safety. And those are all prerequisites for deep healing. They also help us to have containment. And so there can be even lessons in not feeling guilt for creating boundaries whenever you're trying to keep yourself safe, right? When you're wanting to protect your energy. Um, we don't always have to engage. We don't owe someone something that is disturbing our space, or who is projecting their own judgments because they're lacking accountability within themselves, right? Oftentimes, I find whenever we're healing through Saturn, we can actually experience this dynamic where projections of other people's judgments start to happen, because when we are starting to naturally express this archetype, it is mirroring back to someone else what they are lacking within this archetype, and it induces their own self-judgment and shame and guilt around that. And that's actually a call for them to do the healing Saturnian work of self-reflection and accountability and responsibility. That way they can mitigate that, and they are not consciously or unconsciously projecting what it is that they lack around their own authority, because projections of judgments are really someone's lack of authority. All right. When someone is intentionally harming you, or they are scapegoating, or they are projecting their judgments, that is really an overcompensatory tactic, because it's really telling, it's very revealing. And once you know this, it becomes healing, because you can step back and objectify this and it actually doesn't penetrate you. Like it's like you're watching someone and you're actually having compassion for them, because you've created this boundary and you understand and you realize what is actually yours and what isn't. And you're understanding that those dynamics are coming from someone who's really wounded, who lacks a sense of authority, and might even think that they have a sense of authority. But if you have a sense of authority, you don't do those things, right? I feel like a lot of us have had experiences like that. So that is why healing through boundaries is very, very good. It actually really helps to bring that awareness and that wisdom and the compassion, right? And it's also like, no, I'm not going to take this. I know that being my own authority, it protects my energy and it creates safety for myself. And so things tend to be like water off of a duck's back. So healing can also come from transforming judgment into self-reflection, right? If we notice ourselves projecting judgments, um, the healing happens because Saturn is showing us, that judgment is often displaced. Um, it's displaced self-criticism, right? It links back to what I was just talking about. So healing occurs when we turn judgment inward, with curiosity, rather than outward with rigidity. This is why Capricorn has an inconjunct to Gemini. This is just one of the reasons, one of the archetypal dynamics. There's a need to have curiosity whenever we're experiencing shame or guilt or self-criticism that we're not connected with, and we're seeing ourselves constantly judging other people. It's really because there's a self-preservation. It's like there's a fear about, what if I self-reflect and I look at what's really going on inside of me? That's why it's usually linked to some type of trauma. So reclaiming inner authority is a really big one, with healing through Saturn. So true healing, it arises when we stop outsourcing authority and learn to trust our inner authority. And that's through trusting our own lived wisdom. And Saturn really supports the development of an internal moral compass. Someone who is naturally expressing Saturn, they are going to be walking their talk. That's why it's linked with integrity, right? And so when someone is doing that, that is healing their sense of authority. It's when we get into the duplicitousness, again, Gemini linked with Capricorn through the inconjunct. This is another archetype of it. This can be where, if this is the distortion, this is someone who's showing up um, almost like an authority, and they are um, projecting things, or they have a lot of judgment, but yet they are, um, so their actions are reflecting that, but their words are trying to say, they're conveying something else. So there can be this duplicitousness. And that is a key indicator of where one is lacking a sense of authority, a lack of inner authority. It's like what they're talking about is not reflected in their actual actions. So this is again where we're needing to um, lean into the healing qualities of Saturn and how Saturn really supports, you know, that internal compass and being able to have integrity and not being duplicitous. Okay. So this is where we're healing our distorted authority patterns, right? Saturn helps heal the fear of authority. A lot of times you'll see Saturn linked with Mars, and there can be this fear of authority. Um, and so there can be oftentimes a rebellion against authority, or like I said, false authority by um, parroting or appearing to be an authority in something, but yet the actions aren't aligning. And so Saturn, it helps us to heal this, and it's through restoring a grounded, embodied sense of self-leadership. All right. And then it can come in and it can really help us to heal the suppressed emotions that are stored within the body. So when emotions are contained, but they aren't expressed, they often crystallize. That's why Saturn is linked with crystallization. And that can be crystallization of beliefs, any type of conditioning factor. But whenever it's linked with the crystallizations of emotional dynamics because they're not expressed, it often leads into tension and fatigue. And so Saturn healing works somatically. It's slowly releasing what is hardened over time. And that is happening through self-reflection and really going deep within. Um, and it's working with those memories that evoke feelings that then evoke emotions, and then holding it and holding space for it, holding a container for it, and then reflecting on, can I let this go, or am I holding on to this emotion? And then understanding what that feels like and why maybe I'm holding on to anger, why maybe I'm holding on to self-judgment or self-criticism. And so that just it helps us get to kind of the bottom of the barrel, so that way it's unlocking the suppressed emotions, because underneath it it can be fear of being myself, or fear of expressing my own inner authority or my personal voice of authority. There's so many different ways that this can show up. And so it can also be where we're healing futility and learned helplessness. So Saturn, it can really help us to reframe futility as feedback. So when we reflect rather than resist, um, we are able to understand meaning and direction. Um, it's like the meaning and direction occur because we are reframing, we're restructuring the conditioning factors that lead to a loss of authority, sparking futility or helplessness. And so when we have that courage to really self-reflect, by using futility or these really kind of um, dense emotional experiences as feedback, and we don't resist them, that's whenever meaning and direction starts to return and it opens up a new container for us. All right. And so that's where we start to get into this unfolding of how the integration of past experience starts to become wisdom. So Saturn, it can govern in more traditional thoughts of astrology, it governs memory and experience. To me, um, direct experience is the link to Scorpio and the sextile from Scorpio to Capricorn. Um, but memory can be Gemini if it's short term, or it can also be Aquarius if it's long term. So Uranus and Mercury. But the reason why I bring this up is because there are these connections within the zodiac, all right? Through the natural sextile and the inconjunct and the semi-sextile between these different signs. And healing really happens when the past is metabolized into discernment rather than perpetuating the same type of dynamics over and over and over again because we haven't cultivated the wisdom around it because there hasn't been an integration of the past because we haven't self-reflected. Okay. So it's almost like we're frozen in a state of the past traumatic experiences and then we replay them because there's this lack of self-reflection and really looking at what's at the bottom of that barrel again. So Saturn is very much, it brings into question long-term healing versus quick relief. All right. And Saturn really prioritizes sustainability over immediacy. Um, its medicine is slow, lasting, and deeply stabilizing. It's connected to Virgo, so it's helping through Virgo purge these dynamics. And that way, once we have gotten to the center of the emotional experience, it becomes purged, but yet there is this improvement that has gone on and this wisdom that has been gained. And so this can really take time. All right. That's why Saturn, Capricorn, 10th house, it relates to late bloomers sometimes. So, lastly, this is connected to healing through devotion and commitment. Again, there's a linkage to the trine between Virgo and Capricorn. So it supports Saturn, it will support rituals, Virgo, routines, Virgo, and practices that build trust with yourself over time. And so how that is healing is through the self-determination and the self perseverance to create and cultivate a sound structure through rituals, routines, and practices. And that teaches you about trust and learning that you are your own authority. So, when we're looking at transits of Saturn, the way that I really see these as a healing, how it can be healing is that Saturn through transits, it's an initiation and not a punishment. If there's a lot of patriarchal conditioning and overlay, one can feel like a Saturn return or a Saturn square, or Saturn opposition, or transiting Saturn aspecting one of your planets can feel like punishment. And it's not, it's actually an invitation of initiation. Okay. So each Saturn transit is really a rite of passage. Think of it as its maturation process. There's a rite of passage. So something old um, that's been crystallized needs to dissolve in order for something new to start. And as it is integrated, this sense of authority within yourself can emerge further. All right. That's a way that I want to really put that. Um, And when I mean the sense of self, again, this is linking this to Taurus, is that there's an unfolding. We're always, if we're evolving, we're changing, we're growing. That's why Jeffrey Wolf Green talked about the linkage to Aries Mars being a perpetual state of becoming. Well, now you can see the linkage through the square to Saturn or to Capricorn, is that we have to initiate something in order for a more integrated self to emerge through dissolving the past conditioning factors that are really outdated and aren't in alignment with who we are feeling we are um, within ourselves as a sovereign person. And so there's also this healing principle um, when we have these transits of healing through commitment. So Saturn, it can really support therapy or somatic work or spiritual practice and routines that build long-term safety because it's linking it to this understanding what it is that you need, the linkage to Taurus, but making the correct judgment call around that. So it's like if I'm experiencing futility or a destabilization and I'm starting to self-reflect, all of a sudden Capricorn, it sextiles Pisces and Pisces sextiles Taurus through that self-reflection and really wanting to hold accountability and be responsible about my own healing. Just that action, I can start to have whispers from the soul emanate into my inner listening. That's Taurus linked with Pisces. And then it's about trusting that and having faith in yourself. And that is actually restorative. And so it's trusting that this is what I'm actually needing right now. I am needing a deeper therapy, or I'm needing to be come back into my body. There's been so much suppression, maybe there's been fragmentation. And so I'm needing to find someone to do somatic work with, or maybe you're someone who is all of a sudden really starting to feel a connection. And so there needs to be this devotion to a spiritual practice. And, or it's like, I really want to have higher purpose and meaning with my career. And so I'm having to create these routines that will really build long-term safety and um, they feed the ways in which I feel authentic to myself and how I value myself. And that feels like I have a sense of authority now because I know what I can listen to myself. I can make a correct judgment call about what it is that I actually need. And so the gift of Saturn transits is what survives the Saturn transit is real, it's sustainable, and it's aligned with integrity, right? So this is where I really want to talk a little bit about Saturn returns and transits as healing initiations. First, I do want to touch on the first Saturn square, which is 7, 8 years old. This is where we really first get introduced to we only have so much time within space and reality to do what it is that we need to do. And so we start to have respect, Saturn, for that time. Oftentimes, I find an initiation with the first Saturn square is a loss of someone, right? Um, and that loss of someone or being confronted with life or death situations, it really has us understanding that we have only so much time and space to do something in this lifetime. And it's our responsibility to utilize that time in a way that helps with maturation and wisdom. So, a couple of examples is um, my first Saturn square, my dad had his first heart attack. And I remember it was terrifying for me. And that really taught me that we're not here for forever, right? And so for me personally, it had me start looking and reflecting about um, the deeper meanings of life, which was like, why am I here? Like, what am I supposed to do? I want to make sure that I do it and I um make the most out of it, right? That was my personal experience with that Saturn square, that first Saturn square. My oldest kid, their first Saturn square, two things happened. Their father, their biological father, was imprisoned for life for murder. Long story. Some of you guys have heard me speak about this. Um, but that introduced them to boundaries, right? That's another thing that the first Saturn square is teaching us about. But they also lost their grandfather, my stepdad, who is very much a father to me, um, and was the father figure in their life. And so that taught them a lot about how time is limited here, that we're not here for forever. So that's something that we see a lot with the first Saturn square. It's teaching us about boundaries. Think about you in school at that age, and it's teaching us about time and how we're meant to utilize this lifetime in a responsible way so that way we can grow and we can evolve. So Saturn returns, it's 27 to 29, 58 to 60, 87 to 90, roughly within that area. And in a generalized sense, it's a invitation of a restructuring of our consciousness. Up until our first Saturn return, we're really reliving all of the conditioning factors um, of our prior lifetimes. So it's been reconditioning us. And if we have been utilizing and reflecting about what it is that we're supposed to do and how we're meant to utilize time, that first Saturn return can almost be like a reward if we haven't. That's where we hear about the dreaded first Saturn return because what it's doing, it's initiating us back onto the path of regaining our sense of authority. And so it's restructuring our consciousness. Um, so a Saturn return, it's not just a life event, it's a reorganization of how you relate to time, responsibility, and reality within itself. This can be where, oh my gosh, this is what I really want to do in life, and I haven't even been doing it. I've been checking the boxes of what I've been told I'm supposed to do, and like that's not even what I want to do. So there can be this regaining of authority, right? It's where we are confronting inherited conditioning. So that Saturn return, it surfaces familial, cultural, and societal rules that shaped your identity so you can consciously decide what stays and what must be released. Again, this links back to accountability. This is mine, that is not mine, right? And so it's where we start to have this ability, if you've had arrested emotional maturity, maybe you've always been extending your hand down the mountain and giving, and yet you don't know how to give to yourself. Or maybe, there's been a lot of insecurity in your life for whatever reason. This is a time where it can really be healing arrested emotional maturity. So it's areas where emotional development was delayed, Saturn, or suppressed, um, they become visible, not to shame you, not for you to feel judgment of yourself, but it's to invite growth, right? And it's through that self-reflective process and understanding that's not mine, this is, and I can be responsible in what I do with this right here, right now, at this moment in time. Um, so it's also this is bringing in that accountability without punishment. So the Saturn return, it can really ask us, where have you been avoiding responsibility for your own life? So healing comes with accountability. And healing, when linked to accountability, it replaces self-blame and blaming others or judging others and projecting onto them. So this is also where this can be an initiation for a boundary recalibration, relation within your relationships, your career, and the roles and the lack of integrity. That often starts to fall away, so healthier boundaries can be established at this point in time. Um, So as we do that, the reclaiming of boundaries, right? And the healing process within that, that's where we are starting to reclaim our inner authority. So external approval, it can start to lose its power during a Saturn return. And these Saturn returns, they demand the authority come from lived experience and not validation, right? It's not if I do this and someone says good job, um, and I receive validation or I receive validation about my own emotional experience. Listen, we can be validated by many, many people, and that can actually keep us in a box. I've seen many people who surround themselves only with people who validate them because they lack a sense of authority within, because they're really looking for approval or someone to agree with them. And so Saturn can come in through transits or through a Saturn return and really help us to reclaim our sense of inner authority by, you know, knocking away the need for external approval and validation. And so this is also for some people during Saturn transits or Saturn returns, it's where we're ending cycles of futility. It's where repetitive patterns that no longer serve you, they can really reach a breaking point, and it's not as failure, but it's as an invitation to choose differently. So I can tell you, before my first Saturn return, I was doing some work and I was definitely doing Capricorn, but there was also a self-righteousness that I had because I felt like I had done this. And to my horror, my Saturn return came and I realized that I lacked wisdom in blind spots and that me being an authority and helping people really arrested my emotional development. Um, it was a way for me to not deal with or meet my own needs, because I was seeking validation outside of myself instead of being able to mature through validating my inner reality. And I experienced futility and I experienced it through different relationships. And my first kiddo's father, after that relationship ended and all of the things that happened, I experienced an immense of futility. I felt super defeated. And then things within my family, it was the same way. And yet, what ended up happening during my Saturn return is I reflected and I really took a deep dive and understood what was going on inside of me and why I had chosen this and that. And I understood that I was the only person who was going to be able to heal these dynamics, that it wasn't going to come from outside of myself. And that really started to create a new structure within. And it was where I started to empower myself through my own sense of authority. Um, and I haven't experienced futility. And words don't wound me anymore like they used to because I don't seek that validation. Because like words used to really wound me. And it's interesting whenever I regained my sense of inner authority, words of others just they don't. Um, and there was a huge initiation with my family that taught me a lot about that. And then that's the thing about Saturn transits, though. After you have like a Saturn return, if you really do that Saturnian healing work, it starts to accelerate your growth. If you lack accountability, and you don't do the healing Saturnian work, things can start to, over time, bog you down, because you are constantly re-experiencing the childhood dynamics and whatever upheaval happened during that Saturn return, and it comes back to like a lack of accountability. And um, over time, you get a Saturn lesson, um, which can enforce that. And oftentimes it is linked, in my opinion, I've seen this with a lot of people, it is linked with like a public downfall. Because if you think about it, Saturn is connected to the 10th house, and that is at the zenith of the chart. So you're who you are publicly. Um, I've seen it happen time and time again. It's like the other things, the one-on-one relationships didn't really um, teach that lesson. And so it has to be linked to something that's really gonna get you to start self-reflecting. Um, I seen it with there was a family member in my life that experienced that, and they had a really big public downfall, and that is whenever they started to do some self-reflective work. Because a lot of times, if you don't do the Saturnian healing work during that first Saturn return, um, it's also linked to like willful ignorance, right? And really, there's a tenderness to all of this, because at the end, there's this fear of loss of control and a fear of judgment. Um, but Saturn initiations ask us to reflect on all of these areas where we might be afraid in order for us to cultivate mastery, right? It's actually in those places that we are afraid of most that mastery can happen. And that is the beauty of um, the healing of Saturn. So if you're looking at, well, and I want to touch on the second Saturn return is if you started, if you were doing the work, the Saturnian work, Saturn return, first Saturn return happens, it kind of gets you into action. By that second Saturn return, there can be a fruition that happens. If you chose not to do what it is that you needed to do to be responsible and accountable during your first Saturn return, there tends to be the dynamic of very, very, very slow growth in between first Saturn return and second Saturn return, um, and lessons within that. Whereas if you do the Saturn work, that first Saturn return, there's an acceleration, right? So that second Saturn return we have is really speaking to and reflecting back on what was initiated at that first one. So if you are the person who didn't do this Saturnian healing work, um, that's where that initiation can really come in full force. Um, if you did do it the first go around and there was acceleration, well, then it's almost like a reward. And it can be with career. It's like you get to do the passion project because you have created a foundation, and, you know, there's all different ways that that can show up, but it is a deep time of self-reflection about what you want to do with the second half of your life. And then if you get to your third Saturn return, which some people do, that's really more about reflecting on what it is you're wanting to do in your next lifetime. So when we have Saturn transiting personal planets or angles, This is like our ongoing healing work that happens in between our major transits, right? Our major like Saturn squares, Saturn returns, Saturn opposition. So Saturn transiting the moon, this is really where we can have healing through emotional healing through containment. It teaches us emotional regulation and grief processing and the maturation of attachment patterns. A lot of times it can induce um, depression, and that's really signaling to reflect. Like, why am I depressed? What's going on here? Because it's like it's showing us that some type of emotional content has been suppressed. And so that's where it can initiate us into that emotional regulation, the grief processing, and the maturation of attachment. And then if we have Saturn transiting to Venus, this is really where we can experience the healing relationally and our self-worth patterns. So it's clarifying our values and it reveals where love has been conditional and it supports more self-respecting connections. It's where we can say, this is the boundary. This is what I need for my own safety. And this is where I'm responsible and how I give and also how I receive. Um, it has us reflecting on how we relate to ourselves, how we talk to ourselves. Is it self-defeating? Is there a block? Are we judgmental? So it can really have us reflecting on our inner voice and uh, creating a new container around what it is that we are attracting because it's having us reflect on um, how we value ourselves, and that directly corresponds to how we value others and what we attract, right? And then if we're having an initiation with Saturn transiting to Mars, this is really where we can be healing anger, agency, and boundaries, right? Like that's connected to Venus too. I want to say that because I mean, I kind of reflected on that. Um, but anger and healing the anger, whenever it's linked with Saturn, this can be where we've suppressed anger and all of a sudden it's coming out. And that's where the linkage is to boundaries in this sense, because when there are arbitrary, which is very Saturnian word, arbitrary boundaries or unspoken boundaries, and people cross them without us being connected to our own sense of inner authority and what it is that we need. And so we can't speak them. A lot of times anger comes out and it's displaced. There can also be a suppression of anger. I know this really happened whenever I was in my Saturn return. All of a sudden, I realized I was very angry. And um, it's because I wasn't allowed to feel angry growing up. And whenever there was punishment for it, but it was very oppressive um, because my values were very different than my family systems. And um, I didn't realize that I gave my sense of authority over, and I was always having boundaries crossed that were unspoken, because I didn't even know I lacked such a sense of authority in that way that I didn't even know how to connect with boundaries. And it was really this initiation with my anger that had me understand um, how to make choices around boundaries and how to make a correct judgment call instead of being reactionary, which is very much a Saturn to Mars dynamic. So there can be this type of healing initiation. When you have an initiation between Saturn and Mercury, this can really be where we're healing our mental patterns. So it can slow the mind. So thought patterns can really be examined and reflected and refined and made more truthful, right? It's like where we can understand the messages, we can reflect on the messages that were conditioned and where that internalized beliefs and how that affected our sense of meaning and value of ourselves and how that attracted all different types of different dynamics. And lastly, when we have an initiation between Saturn to the sun. This can really be healing our personal will and our vitality and the authority, right? So it's restructuring the sense of creative purpose, and it's often through tests that really build authenticity and self-trust. In my experience, it's like where there can be an initiation of the hero's journey. So we want to keep in mind that Saturn transits and the healing of time is where we're really needing to slow down to integrate experience. So these Saturn transits often feel restrictive because they force us to metabolize life rather than bypass it, right? And so there's like a restoring of a coherent sense of time that can happen when we're accessing this in a natural way. It's the trauma distorts time and perceptions. And so Saturn transits bring past, present, and future into conscious alignment. That way we can really restore that sense of time. That way we're not projecting the past onto the present moment anymore. And so it's also teaching us patience as a healing skill. So these transits can initiate this um, training period of endurance, I want to say. And it's not as suffering, it's as steadiness, right? It's like, oh, this I wish this would take longer. And this is what we need to remember on a soul level. Things take as long as necessary. Some of us mature faster than others. Some of us are further along the path than others, and that's okay, right? But there is an initiation with a Saturnian transit around endurance and self-determination and steadiness. Um, And Saturn transits can really induce Saturnian test of self-determination. Self-determination of what? To not be who we once were. All right. Once you feel like, ah, I've passed this test, all of a sudden something can go on. I've talked about it many times. And it's about applying that wisdom from that initiation and now making a correct judgment call and being self-determined. That's not who I am anymore. This is who I am. So it brings in authority, accountability, responsibility, and integrity in those moments. So the last thing I think I want to say is when we're talking about Saturnian transits as trauma and also what Jung called shadow healing, this is where there are these initiations of Saturn coming in and it initiates a dynamic where there's a surfacing of those suppressed emotions and where we're learning how to do this safely. Saturn creates conditions where buried emotions rise gradually and preventing overwhelm. It's where we're transforming judgment into discernment. Inner critics become teachers within our reality because we're self-reflecting. And so those inner critics becoming teachers, that happens when they're met with reflection instead of resistance. It's not something to be afraid of. Remember that what you fear the most is actually where you have the ability to have the most mastery. And so there can also be this healing of authority wounds, like I said. So the Saturn transits expose where authority has been externalized, feared, or abused. So it's offering the chance to reclaim sovereignty. So if authority has been abused, we can have a Saturn initiation and it could feel like punishment, but it's actually teaching us accountability in order for us to reclaim a natural sense of authority, our sovereignty. So, this is my spiel on Saturn and healing, and I hope that it was helpful. And I want you to think about some of this with the Capricorn new moon. I also want to invite you to, if you're interested in signing up for the Lucifer lecture, I will put the link below. This is something that I feel like is really, when we are healing through Saturn and understanding that it's medicine, it links beautifully with Lucifer as the bearer of light, and also where there can be these influences that keep us from being our own authority. And so, if you're really wanting to understand the influence of malevolence and also the bearer of light, I have that Lucifer lecture that's coming up next month on February 7th, I believe, and I'll post a link below. I also have the Conscience Compass group that I started where um, you can receive a monthly email with a private link where I have a video of discussing the month ahead. I don't do that on my channel. I am going to do that for this group. I will have a live Q&A monthly where you can ask questions and there can be a sense of community. I'm also going to, in that email, send out um, the transit of the month, something that, we could all focus on that's really teaching us about containment and um, healing and deconditioning or whatever it may be. Um, so you can sign up for that on my website as well. I'm really excited for that. Um, and I'm thinking, what I will say is, I am finishing up a 170-page workbook. It's called the Conscience Compass Workbook. And you can get that on my website. It's a downloadable PDF. It's like journal slash personalized workbook of your chart. So a lot of the pages are journaling pages, and there's also writing prompts, reflective questions, and I put your chart in that workbook and I explain your chart. Your moon, your nodes through the lens of evolutionary astrology, and I go over the planets and their archetypal meaning through evolutionary astrology. So it teaches a bit about this, and then I talk a little bit about each of your planets by sign. Um, so that is on my website as well. I'm really excited about it. I feel really proud of it, actually. I am probably going to post like a short video soon, then the next few days, where I show you like what exactly it looks like. But I feel like I'm someone who really wants each one of us to feel like we're understanding astrology on our own instead of looking at someone as an authority in it. Like, it's great to be known as an authority in something, but really, I want to promote a sense of authority in others. Um, that way they feel connected with their own chart. It's not just me telling you what your chart is, and you know the goal is for people to not come see me for forever. It's for them to feel empowered and to have their sense of authority, right? Um, to not have that dependency. And I really like how I've structured that workbook because it's a way to connect with your own chart And there's a lot of reflective questions in there that you can write about. There's also pages in there where you can um, collage or decoupage. There's also different herbs and stones or meditative practices that you can work with for each one of the planets. Um, and these are things that I've done that helped me connect with astrology. And luckily for you all, I have journaled my whole life and have journaled. I have a journal. I have all my journals since I was 12 years old. Like, it's crazy. My point being is, I went back and I reviewed my journals of um, when I started to really understand astrology, and I looked at what it was that I was doing that really helped me connect with my own chart and with the archetypes. And so I used that as a format to create this kind of journal workbook for you guys. So, Capricorn new moon is coming up on the 18th. And if you haven't checked out that video yet, go ahead and do that. And I just appreciate you all so much for tuning in, and I hope you enjoyed this. Until later.